He was 6 feet deep in his own grave when the first girl appeared. Caleb Morrison wiped the sweat from his forehead with dirt-stained hands, the shovel trembling in his grip. The Texas sun beat down mercilessly on his weathered face as he stood in the hole he'd been digging for 3 hours straight. At 42, he figured this was how it should end. Alone, forgotten, buried in the same God-forsaken land that had taken everything from him. The wooden cross he'd carved bore simple words, "Here lies a man who gave up. No name needed." Nobody left to remember it anyway. But as he raised the shovel for another scoop of red dirt, a shadow fell across the grave's edge. Then another, and another. 5 small figures stood silhouetted against the blazing afternoon sky, their faces hidden but their presence undeniable. Children. Girls, by the look of their torn dresses and tangled hair. The oldest couldn't be more than 14. The youngest barely 6. Caleb's shovel froze mid-swing. In 3 years of living like a hermit on this abandoned ranch, he'd seen exactly 0 visitors. The nearest town was 15 miles through desert that could kill a grown man, let alone children. "Mister," the tallest girl spoke, her voice steady despite the tremor in her small frame. "We need your help." Caleb squinted up at them, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. These weren't town children out for a stroll. Their clothes were filthy, torn, like they'd been running for days. Dried blood stained the oldest girl's sleeve. The smallest one clutched a rag doll with its head hanging by threads. "How the hell did you get here?" he growled, immediately regretting his language in front of children. "We walked," the leader said simply, "for 2 days. 2 days. Through desert that had no water, no shade, no mercy." Caleb felt something crack inside his chest, something that had been frozen solid since the day he'd buried his own family. But he pushed the feeling down. He didn't want to care. Couldn't afford to care. He was supposed to be dead by sundown. "Well, you can't stay here," he said, gripping the shovel tighter. "This is private property, and I'm busy." The girl's eyes dropped to the grave, then back to his face. She didn't ask questions. "Smart kid. They'll kill us if we go back," she said quietly. The words hit Caleb like a punch to the gut. Kill them? These were children, not outlaws. But the fear in her voice was real, raw, the kind of terror that came from experiencing genuine evil. He studied their faces more carefully. Bruises on the youngest one's arms, cuts on another's hands that looked defensive. These girls weren't lost. They were running. "Who's trying to kill you?" he heard himself ask, though he immediately wished he hadn't. "The men from the orphanage," the leader whispered. "They think we saw something we shouldn't have." Caleb's blood went cold. An orphanage. He'd heard rumors about places like that, institutions where unwanted children disappeared, where money changed hands for reasons no decent person wanted to imagine. The smallest girl started crying, a sound that cut through the desert silence like a knife. The oldest immediately knelt beside her, whispering comfort with the practiced ease of someone who'd been protecting others far longer than any child should have to. That's when Caleb noticed the dust cloud on the horizon, moving fast, coming straight toward his ranch. The leader girl saw it too. Her face went white as bone. "They found us," she breathed. Caleb looked at the approaching riders, then at the 5 terrified children standing beside his half-dug grave. Every instinct screamed at him to send them away, to climb back into that hole and finish what he'd started. But something in the oldest girl's eyes, a desperate courage that reminded him of someone he'd lost long ago, made him pause. The dust cloud was getting closer. Whatever evil these children were running from was about to arrive at his doorstep, and suddenly, Caleb Morrison had to make a choice he never thought he'd face again: die as planned, or fight for something worth living for. The sound of hoofbeats echoed across the desert, growing louder by the second. Time stopped as Caleb stared at those approaching riders, his mind racing faster than the hoofbeats thundering toward them. "Get inside the house," he barked at the girls, scrambling out of the grave. "Now!" But the oldest girl grabbed his arm, her small fingers surprisingly strong. "You don't understand. They have papers, legal papers. If they find us here, they'll take us back and you'll be charged with kidnapping." Kidnapping. The word hit Caleb like a sledgehammer. He wasn't just looking at scared children anymore. He was staring at a legal nightmare that could destroy what little life he had left. "Then why did you come here?" he demanded. "Because you're the only person for miles who isn't connected to them," she said desperately. "The sheriff, the mayor, the judge, they all take money from Mr. Thornton. Thornton. Caleb knew that name. Everyone in 3 counties knew Silas Thornton, the man who owned half the territory's businesses and had his fingers in every dirty deal from cattle rustling to claim jumping. The hoofbeats were close enough now that Caleb could count them. 4 riders, moving fast but not frantically, like men confident in their authority. "What's your name?" he asked the girl quickly. "Emma. Emma Thorne. Thorne. Not Thornton, but close enough to make Caleb's stomach twist. Family connection? Or just bad luck? The little ones?" He gestured to the other girls huddled behind Emma. "My sisters. Mary, Beth, Lucy, and Alice." Emma's voice cracked slightly. "We're all that's left. All that's left." The words carried weight that made Caleb's chest tighten. Whatever had happened to these girls, it had taken everything else away from them. The riders were now close enough that Caleb could see their faces. Hard men with harder eyes, wearing the kind of clothes that said they had money and authority. The leader wore a deputy's badge that caught the sunlight like a threat. "All right," Caleb said, his decision crystallizing with startling clarity. "Here's what we're going to do." He grabbed the shovel and started rapidly filling in the grave, his movements urgent but controlled. "Emma, take your sisters to the root cellar behind the house. There's a hidden entrance under the old wagon. Stay quiet no matter what you hear." "What about you?" Emma whispered. "I'm going to convince them you were never here." But even as he said it, Caleb knew it wouldn't be that simple. These men didn't strike him as the type to give up easily. And if Emma was right about their connections, they had legal power backing their search. The girls disappeared around the house just as the riders crested the small hill that bordered Caleb's property. He forced himself to keep shoveling, playing the part of a man simply filling in a hole. Nothing suspicious here. The deputy pulled up about 20 feet away, close enough to talk but far enough to draw his gun if needed. His 3 companions spread out in a loose semicircle, their horses snorting and pawing at the ground. "Afternoon," the deputy called out, his voice carrying fake politeness that fooled nobody. "I'm Deputy Marcus Webb. We're looking for some runaway children." Caleb didn't stop shoveling. "Haven't seen any children. Don't get many visitors out here." 5 girls, Webb continued, his eyes scanning the property. Ages 6 to 14. They escaped from the Thornton Children's Home 2 days ago. Like I said, haven't seen anyone. Caleb finally stopped digging and leaned on the shovel, meeting Webb's stare. "This is private property, by the way." Webb's smile was all teeth and no warmth. "We have a warrant to search any property within a 50-mile radius. These children are considered dangerous." Dangerous. 5 terrified little girls, dangerous. The lie was so outrageous that Caleb almost laughed, but the deputy's hand resting on his gun butt suggested this wasn't a joke. "Dangerous how?" Caleb asked. "They witnessed something they shouldn't have," one of the other riders said, then immediately shut up when Webb shot him a warning look. "Witnessed something." Emma's words echoed in Caleb's memory. "They think we saw something we shouldn't have." The pieces of a very ugly picture were starting to come together, and Caleb didn't like what he was seeing. These weren't lawmen looking for runaway orphans. These were cleanup men, sent to silence witnesses. "Well," Caleb said carefully, "feel free to look around, but do it quick. I've got work to finish before dark." Webb nodded to his men, who dismounted and began searching the property. They moved with the thoroughness of experienced hunters, checking every hiding spot a child might use. Caleb continued filling the grave, each shovelful of dirt feeling heavier than the last, not because of the physical weight, but because of what it represented. He was burying his old life, the life of a man who'd given up, and with each scoop, he was committing himself to something he'd sworn never to do again. Care about someone other than himself. One of the searchers emerged from behind the house, shaking his head. Webb's jaw tightened with frustration. "Mighty big property for one man," Webb observed. "Must get lonely." "I like lonely," Caleb replied. "Most folks around here know to cooperate with the law," Webb said, his tone shifting to something harder. "Folks who don't cooperate sometimes find themselves facing serious charges." The threat hung in the desert air like smoke from a brush fire. Caleb straightened up, his hand unconsciously moving closer to the pistol on his hip. "That sounds almost like a threat." "Deputy, just stating facts," Webb said. "Those girls are carrying stolen property. Anyone harboring them would be considered an accessory to theft." Stolen property. Another lie to add to the pile. But Caleb was beginning to understand the game. These men weren't interested in justice. They were interested in covering up whatever those girls had witnessed. The searchers finished their sweep and reported back to Webb with subtle headshakes. No sign of the children. But instead of looking relieved, Webb looked angrier. "You sure you haven't seen anything unusual?" he pressed. 5 girls traveling alone through the desert. That's not something a man forgets. "I'm sure," Caleb said firmly. Webb studied him for a long moment, then glanced at the partially filled grave. "What were you burying?" "Dead horse," Caleb lied smoothly. "Died of colic yesterday." Funny thing to bury so close to the house. Funny thing to question a man's choices on his own property. The tension stretched between them like a rope about to snap. Webb's hand moved closer to his gun, and Caleb felt his own muscles coiling for action. But then Webb seemed to reconsider. Maybe it was the look in Caleb's eyes, the look of a man who had nothing left to lose. Maybe it was the calculation that a shootout over missing orphans might raise questions they didn't want raised. "We'll be back," Webb said finally, gathering his reins. "Those girls can't hide forever. And when we find them, we'll remember who helped and who didn't." The 4 men rode away, their horses kicking up dust that hung in the air like a promise of trouble to come. Caleb watched until they disappeared over the horizon, then immediately headed for the root cellar. He found the girls huddled together in the darkness, Emma's arms wrapped protectively around her younger sisters. "Are they gone?" Emma whispered. "For now," Caleb said. "But they'll be back, and next time they might bring more men." Emma's face fell. "We should go. We shouldn't have come here. Now you're in danger too." Caleb looked at the 5 frightened faces staring up at him in the dim light. He thought about Webb's threats, about the legal trouble he was courting, about the simple life he'd been planning to end just an hour ago. Then he thought about what kind of men would chase children through the desert and call them dangerous. "No," he said firmly. "You're staying right here." But even as he said it, Caleb knew that decision would change everything. Because men like Webb didn't give up. They escalated. And somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled across the desert sky, though there wasn't a cloud in sight. As night fell over the ranch, Caleb found himself doing something he hadn't done in 3 years, cooking for more than one person. The girls sat around his small kitchen table, their faces clean for the first time in days, but their eyes still carrying shadows too dark for children to bear. Emma kept glancing toward the windows, her body coiled with tension that reminded Caleb of a wild animal ready to bolt. "Tell me what you saw," he said quietly, setting plates of beans and cornbread in front of them. Emma shook her head immediately. "The less you know, the safer you are." "I'm already in this," Caleb replied. "Those men will be back. And when they come, I need to know what I'm up against." The youngest girl, Alice, looked up from her plate with eyes that belonged on someone much older. "We saw Mr. Thornton hurt a lady." "Alice, no," Emma whispered urgently. But Alice continued, her small voice steady with the terrible certainty of truth. "She was screaming, and then she wasn't anymore." The words hit the kitchen like a physical blow. Caleb felt his blood turn to ice as the implications sank in. These children hadn't just witnessed abuse. They'd witnessed murder. "Where did this happen?" he asked carefully. "In the basement of the children's home," Emma said, her voice barely audible. "We were supposed to be asleep, but Alice had nightmares. We were going to get her some water when we heard—" She trailed off, unable to finish. "The lady was asking about missing children." Beth, about 10 years old, added quietly. "She had papers. She was saying she was going to tell everyone what Mr. Thornton was doing." A journalist, Caleb realized. Or maybe a government inspector. Someone asking too many questions about where the orphans were really going. "That's why they want us back," Emma said. "We're the only ones who saw. If we're gone, there's no witnesses." Caleb finished grimly. The room fell silent except for the desert wind rattling the windows. Caleb's mind raced through the implications. These weren't just runaway orphans. They were walking death sentences. Thornton would never stop hunting them, and with his money and connections, he had resources that a lone rancher couldn't match. "There's something else," Emma said hesitantly. "The lady, before she died, she gave me this." She reached into her torn dress and pulled out a small leather journal, its pages yellowed and worn. She said if anything happened to her, someone needed to know the truth. Caleb took the journal with hands that weren't quite steady. He opened it to the first page and felt his world tilt on its axis. The handwriting was neat, precise, documenting names, dates, and payments. A complete record of Thornton's operation, not just the children's home, but a network of trafficking that stretched across 3 territories. Children bought and sold like cattle. Some sent to work in mines where they'd die within months. Others shipped to brothels in distant cities. The youngest ones simply disappeared, their fates recorded only as special orders, with astronomical payment amounts. Sweet Jesus, Caleb breathed, his hands shaking as he turned page after page of documented horror. She was going to send it to the territorial governor, Emma said, but they killed her before she could. Caleb closed the journal, his mind reeling. This wasn't just evidence of murder. It was proof of systematic evil that reached into the highest levels of territorial government. With this journal, they could destroy Thornton and everyone connected to him, but that also made it the most dangerous object in 3 territories. They know she had this? He asked. Emma nodded. They tore her room apart looking for it. That's when we knew we had to run. A new sound cut through the night, the distant rumble of multiple horses moving fast. Too many horses for a simple search party. Caleb moved to the window and felt his stomach drop. At least a dozen riders were approaching, torches flickering in the darkness like angry stars. This wasn't a police search anymore. This was a hunting party. They brought an army, he said grimly. Emma was already gathering her sisters, her movements sharp with practiced fear. We have to go, right now. But Caleb shook his head. It's too late. They've got us surrounded. Through the window, he could see riders spreading out around the property, cutting off every escape route. These men had come prepared for a siege, not a search. The cellar again? Emma asked desperately. They'll tear this place apart board by board, Caleb said. They know you're here. Mary, about 8 years old, started crying silently, tears streaming down her dirt-stained cheeks. Lucy, barely 7, clutched her broken doll tighter as if it could protect her from what was coming. Caleb looked at the 5 terrified faces staring at him, then at the journal in his hands. Evidence that could bring down a monster, but only if it survived the night. A voice boomed across the desert, amplified by a speaking trumpet. Morrison, we know they're in there. Send them out and we'll make this easy. Easy. As if there was an easy way to hand children over to murderers. Caleb moved to his gun cabinet and started loading weapons with swift, practiced movements. A rifle, his pistol, a shotgun that had belonged to his father. What are you doing? Emma whispered. What I should have done 3 years ago, Caleb said, checking the cylinder of his Colt. Standing up to evil. You can't fight them all, Emma protested. There are too many. Maybe, Caleb agreed. But I'll make sure they remember this night. He handed Emma the journal. There's a loose board in the back bedroom floor. Hide this there. If something happens to me, find a way to get it to the territorial capital. The voice outside boomed again, closer now. You've got 5 minutes, Morrison. Then we're coming in. Caleb looked out the window at the ring of armed men surrounding his home. 12 against 1. Not great odds, but he'd faced worse during the war. The difference was, back then he'd been fighting for abstracts, country, honor, duty. Tonight he was fighting for something much more powerful. Tonight, he was fighting for children who had no one else. Get in the back room, he told the girls quietly. Whatever you hear, don't come out until morning. Emma grabbed his sleeve. Mr. Morrison, what you're doing? Why? Caleb paused, thinking of his own children, lost to fever 3 years ago, of the man he'd been before grief had carved out his heart. Because some things are worth dying for, he said simply. Outside, the 5 minutes were up, and the first torch was already flying toward his roof. The torch hit the roof with a shower of sparks, and Caleb's world exploded into chaos. Fire on the roof, he shouted to the girls as he kicked out the front window and took aim at the nearest rider. His first shot dropped the man from his horse, the sound echoing across the desert like thunder. The response was immediate and devastating. Gunfire erupted from all sides, bullets splintering wood and shattering glass as the ranch house became a fortress under siege. Caleb rolled away from the window as lead projectiles tore through the air where his head had been. The smell of smoke was already creeping through the house as flames licked at the wooden shingles above. The whole place is going to burn, he muttered, crawling to another window for a better angle. Through the chaos, he could hear Webb's voice shouting orders. Don't kill Morrison unless you have to. We need him alive to sign a confession. A confession? They weren't just here to murder witnesses. They were here to frame him for harboring criminals. Dead heroes couldn't contradict official stories. Another volley of shots forced Caleb to duck as wood splinters exploded around him. He counted muzzle flashes and calculated angles. 12 men positioned strategically around the property, with more probably watching the back routes. But these weren't soldiers. They were hired guns and corrupt lawmen, used to intimidating unarmed civilians, not fighting someone who shot back. Caleb proved that point by putting his next bullet through the shoulder of a man trying to flank the house. The wounded gunman's scream cut through the night, followed by cursing that would make a saloon blush. "Morrison!" Webb's voice carried over the gunfire. "Those children are criminals! You're harboring fugitives! And you're a murderer!" Caleb shouted back, pumping his rifle and taking aim at another shadow. The fire above was spreading faster now, casting dancing light across the desert battlefield. Smoke poured through gaps in the ceiling, making breathing difficult and visibility worse. From the back room came the sound of coughing. The girls were trapped between armed killers outside and growing flames above. That's when Caleb realized the horrible genius of their plan. They didn't need to storm the house. They just needed to wait for the fire to drive everyone out. Then they could claim the children died in the blaze while trying to escape justice. "Emma," he called out, "the back bedroom window. Can you get it open?" "It's stuck," came her reply, followed by more coughing. Caleb cursed under his breath. The house was becoming a death trap, but stepping outside meant walking into a crossfire that would cut them all down in seconds. Unless he gave them something else to think about. Moving fast, Caleb grabbed a lantern and threw it against the front wall, spreading burning oil across the wooden planks. If they wanted fire, he'd give them more than they bargained for. The flames leaped higher, illuminating the entire front yard and exposing 3 gunmen who'd been using darkness for cover. Caleb's rifle spoke twice more, sending them scrambling for new positions. But the victory was costly. The increased flames meant less time before the roof collapsed, and the smoke was getting thicker by the minute. "The children are going to suffocate." Emma's voice was strained with desperation. Caleb made a decision that went against every survival instinct he had. Loading his shotgun with both barrels, he kicked open the front door and stepped onto the porch. "Here I am," he roared into the night. "Come and take me." The concentrated firepower that answered nearly tore him apart. Bullets chewed up the porch around him as he dove behind a water trough, buckshot and rifle balls turning the night into a storm of lead. But his desperate gamble worked. Every gun was now focused on him, giving the girls a chance to escape through the back. He hoped. A bullet clipped his shoulder, spinning him around and sending fire through his left arm. Another shattered the water trough, soaking him with precious liquid that steamed in the heat from the burning house. "Got him!" someone shouted triumphantly. But Caleb wasn't finished. Rolling sideways, he came up with the shotgun and caught 2 men rushing the porch in the open. Both barrels discharged in a thunderous roar that sent them tumbling backward into the dirt. The return fire was immediate and furious, forcing him to scramble behind a pile of lumber as bullets whistled past his ears. That's when he heard it, the sound that made his blood turn to ice. Alice was screaming, not the scream of fear or pain, but the shriek of a child in absolute terror. It was coming from behind the house, where the girls were supposed to be escaping. They'd been caught. "We got them!" Webb's voice carried clearly over the gunfire. "All 5, come out, Morrison, or we start cutting throats." Caleb felt something break inside his chest. He'd failed. After everything, the fight, the fire, the desperate last stand, he'd failed to save them. "You want me?" he called out, his voice hoarse from smoke and rage. "Let them go, and I'll come out unarmed." "No deal," Webb replied. "You're both coming with us, but if you surrender now, maybe some of these children live to see morning." Maybe. The word carried all the cruelty of false hope. Caleb looked at his remaining ammunition. 3 bullets in the rifle, 4 in his pistol. Not enough to fight through 12 men and rescue 5 children, but maybe enough for something else. The journal, hidden under the loose floorboard in the back room, now filling with smoke and flames. Evidence that could destroy Thornton's entire operation. If it survived the fire. If you were Caleb, what would you do? Surrender and hope these murderers show mercy to innocent children, or make one final desperate play that could save the evidence but doom them all? Tell me in the comments. I need to know which side you'd choose, because what Caleb decided next would either redeem his soul or damn it forever. Moving with purpose born of absolute desperation, he began crawling back toward the burning house. Not to surrender, but to retrieve the one thing that could make their deaths mean something. The roof creaked ominously above, ready to collapse at any moment, and somewhere in the darkness, Alice was still screaming. Chapter 5. Caleb crawled through smoke and flames toward the back bedroom, his lungs burning with each breath as the house groaned around him like a dying beast. The floorboard was exactly where he'd told Emma to hide the journal, but now it was hot enough to blister skin. Using his knife, he pried it up and felt relief wash over him as his fingers closed around the leather-bound evidence. That's when he heard footsteps on the front porch. They were coming in. Through the smoke, he could see shapes moving through the doorway. 3 men with bandanas over their faces, guns drawn, searching for survivors. They moved carefully, expecting resistance, but they weren't prepared for what Caleb had planned. He stuffed the journal inside his vest and grabbed the kerosene lamp from the bedside table. The house was already burning, but what he needed was an explosion big enough to scatter their attackers and create chaos. Moving quietly to the kitchen, he found what he was looking for: his store of blasting powder, kept for clearing rocks from fields. Enough to level half the house. The footsteps were getting closer. "Check the back rooms." Webb's voice carried through the smoke. "Morrison's in here somewhere." Caleb poured the powder around the kitchen, creating a trail that led to the largest concentration. If he timed this right, the explosion would blow out the back wall and give him a chance to reach the girls. If he timed it wrong, he'd be scattered across 3 counties. "Found something," one of the searchers called out. "Blood trail leading to the kitchen." Time was up. Caleb lit the kerosene-soaked rag he'd prepared and dropped it onto the powder trail. The fire raced along the floor like a living thing, giving him maybe 10 seconds before the entire kitchen became a bomb. He dove through the window just as the explosion tore through the house. The blast was devastating. The entire back wall disintegrated in a shower of wood and flame, the shockwave knocking down 2 men who'd been guarding the rear. The 3 searchers inside simply vanished in the fireball that erupted from what had been the kitchen. Caleb hit the ground hard, his ears ringing and his vision blurred from the concussion. But he was alive, and more importantly, he could see the girls. They were tied to a wagon about 50 yards away. Surrounded by the remaining gunmen, who were now stumbling and disoriented from the explosion. Webb was shouting orders, but his voice seemed to come from underwater. Alice was no longer screaming. She sat perfectly still, her small body rigid with terror that had gone beyond sound. That's when Caleb saw something that made his blood boil with rage. Emma's dress was torn in a way that had nothing to do with their escape attempt. Her face was bruised, and she held herself with the careful posture of someone trying to hide fresh pain. They'd hurt her. These animals had put their hands on a 14-year-old girl. All thoughts of strategy and survival burned away in a furnace of pure fury. Caleb rose from the rubble like an avenging spirit, his rifle speaking death as he charged toward the wagon. His first shot took down the man closest to Emma. His second sent another gunman spinning into the dirt. The remaining men scrambled for cover, but Caleb was among them now, fighting with the savage intensity of a man who had nothing left to lose. A pistol barked to his left, the bullet creasing his ribs and spinning him around. He answered with the butt of his rifle, crushing the shooter's skull and snatching his weapon. "Kill him!" Webb screamed from behind the wagon. "Kill him now!" But Webb's men were discovering that there's a difference between murdering children and fighting a man who's already considered himself dead. Caleb fought like a demon, using every dirty trick he'd learned in 2 wars and 3 decades of frontier living. He grabbed one gunman and used him as a shield, while putting a bullet through another. When his makeshift protection died, he threw the body at Webb and rolled behind a water barrel, reloading with hands that moved automatically despite the chaos. The tide was turning. What had started as 12 against 1 was now 4 against 1, and the 4 remaining men were starting to break. But breaking men were the most dangerous kind. "Enough!" Webb roared, pressing his gun against Emma's temple. "Drop your weapons or I blow her brains out." Caleb froze, his rifle halfway to his shoulder. Through the smoke and firelight, he could see Emma's eyes, brave and defiant even with a gun to her head. "You're done, Morrison," Webb panted, blood streaming from a cut on his forehead. "Drop the guns and maybe I'll make it quick." Caleb looked at the remaining 3 gunmen, all with their weapons trained on him. At the 5 girls tied to the wagon, their faces streaked with tears and soot. At Emma, who was trying to mouth something to him despite the gun against her skull. The word she was forming was clear: run. But Caleb Morrison had run from enough things in his life. His family's death, his responsibility, his chance to be the man he should have been. "You know what, Webb?" he said, slowly lowering his rifle. "You're right, I'm done." Webb smiled triumphantly, relaxing slightly. That's when Caleb pulled the hidden derringer from his boot and put both barrels through Webb's chest. The deputy's gun discharged as he fell, the bullet going wide, and chaos erupted again as the remaining gunmen opened fire. But something had changed in that moment of defiance. The girls weren't screaming anymore. They were fighting. Emma had worked one hand free and was untying her sisters. Mary and Beth were kicking at their captors. Even little Alice was biting the hand of the man trying to hold her. And Caleb? Caleb Morrison was no longer the broken man who'd been digging his own grave that morning. He was something much more dangerous. He was a man with something to protect. But as he reached for Webb's fallen gun, he saw a movement in the distance that made his heart sink. More riders, at least 20 of them, coming fast from the direction of town. Thornton himself was coming to finish this personally. 20 riders thundered across the desert like the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. But Caleb Morrison was no longer the same man who'd faced 12. The journal pressed against his chest like a talisman as he helped Emma cut her sisters free from the wagon. Blood streaked his face from a dozen small wounds, and his left arm hung uselessly from the shoulder wound. But his eyes burned with purpose that hadn't existed 12 hours ago. "Can you ride?" he asked Emma quickly. "Yes," she said, her voice steady despite everything she'd endured. "Take the wagon. Head north toward the canyon. There's a cave about 3 miles up the ridge. You can hide there." "What about you?" Mary asked, her 8-year-old voice trembling. Caleb looked at the approaching dust cloud, then at Webb's body sprawled in the dirt. The remaining 3 gunmen had scattered when the shooting started, but they'd be back with reinforcements. "I'm going to buy you time," he said simply. Emma grabbed his arm. "You can't fight 20 men." "I don't have to fight them," Caleb replied, pulling the journal from his vest. "I just have to make sure this survives." He pressed the leather-bound evidence into Emma's hands. "Get this to the territorial capital. Find someone who can't be bought. A newspaper editor, a federal marshal, someone. They'll kill you," Emma whispered. "Maybe," Caleb admitted. "But they were going to kill me anyway. At least this way it means something." The thunder of hoofbeats was getting closer. In the firelight from the burning house, Caleb could make out the lead rider, a tall man in an expensive suit, riding a horse that cost more than most people made in a year. Silas Thornton, the devil himself, come to clean up his own mess. "Go," Caleb urged the girls. "Now." But Emma hesitated, her young face torn between survival and something that looked disturbingly like loyalty. "You saved us," she said quietly. "No," Caleb replied, checking his remaining ammunition. "You saved me." The girls climbed into the wagon, Emma taking the reins with the competence of someone who'd been forced to grow up too fast. As they pulled away toward the canyon, Caleb felt something ease in his chest. For the first time in 3 years, he'd done something that mattered. Thornton's riders were close enough now that Caleb could see individual faces. Hard men, professional killers, the kind of scum that money could always buy. But at their head rode Thornton himself, and that was a mistake. Rich men should never lead their own dirty work. Caleb positioned himself behind the overturned water trough, using the burning house as backlight to silhouette his targets. He had maybe 30 bullets left between his rifle and the weapons he'd scavenged. Against 20 men, it should have been hopeless. But Caleb had advantages they didn't know about. He knew this land. Every rock, every gully, every shadow that could hide a man or stop a bullet. He'd spent 3 years learning every inch of this property, mapping it in his grief-addled mind during long nights when sleep wouldn't come, and he was no longer afraid to die. "Morrison!" Thornton's voice cut across the desert as the riders pulled up just outside rifle range. "I hear you've been harboring criminals." "I hear you've been murdering children," Caleb shouted back. Thornton's laugh was cold as winter wind. "Those weren't children, Morrison. They were witnesses to a tragic accident. A woman who fell down some stairs in my institution." "Fell downstairs," Caleb repeated. "After you pushed her. Accidents happen," Thornton said with mock sadness. "Just like the accident that's about to happen to you." The rich man gestured to his hired guns, who began spreading out in a wide circle. Professional movements, designed to surround and eliminate. These weren't the sloppy amateurs Webb had brought. These men knew their business. But so did Caleb. His first shot dropped the man trying to flank left, the sound echoing across the desert like judgment. Before the body hit the ground, Caleb had shifted position, rolling to a new spot behind a pile of lumber. The return fire was immediate and devastating, but they were shooting at where he'd been, not where he was. His second shot caught a rider trying to circle behind the burning house. The man's scream spooked his horse, which bolted back toward the main group, creating confusion in their ranks. $20,000 to whoever brings me his head, Thornton screamed, his composure cracking as Caleb proved harder to kill than expected. 20,000. Enough to make even loyal men consider betrayal. Caleb used their greed against them, firing deliberately at the men who seemed most eager for the bounty. Create paranoia in the ranks, make them wonder who they could trust. His strategy worked. When he wounded a third man, two others immediately turned their guns on each other, each suspecting the other of trying to claim the full reward. But the diversion only lasted seconds before Thornton restored order, with threats and curses. "Burn him out," the rich man commanded. "Man, set fire to everything. Flush him into the open." New torches blazed to life as Thornton's men began systematically igniting every structure on the property. The barn caught first, then the chicken coop, then the small shed where Caleb had stored winter feed. Soon he'd be surrounded by fire with nowhere to run. That's when he heard something that made his heart leap with hope and terror in equal measure. Gunfire, coming from the direction of the canyon. The girls were in trouble, but as Caleb started to move toward the sound, Thornton spotted him in the firelight. "There, kill him!" A dozen guns opened fire simultaneously, and Caleb Morrison found himself facing the final choice of his reclaimed life. Save himself and hope the girls escaped on their own, or charge into certain death trying to reach them. For a man who'd been digging his own grave 12 hours ago, it wasn't really a choice at all. Caleb Morrison did something that no sane man would do. He charged directly into the gunfire, screaming like a banshee as he ran toward the canyon where the girls were fighting for their lives. Bullets whined past his ears as he zigzagged across the desert, using every scrap of cover the barren landscape offered. A rock here, a dead cactus there, the twisted remains of an old fence post that had been shot to splinters years ago. Behind him, Thornton's voice rose above the chaos. "Don't let him reach the canyon. He's got something we need." Something they needed. The journal. They knew Emma had it, which meant someone had seen the exchange, which meant the girls were facing more than just a few stray gunmen who'd caught up to them. A bullet clipped Caleb's leg, sending fire through his thigh, but he kept running. Pain was just another enemy now, and he'd been fighting enemies all night. The gunfire from the canyon was getting louder, more desperate. He could hear Emma's voice shouting orders to her sisters, trying to coordinate their defense. That girl had more courage in her little finger than most grown men had in their entire bodies. As he crested the ridge that led down into the canyon, Caleb saw a sight that made his blood turn to molten lead. The wagon was overturned, one wheel spinning lazily in the firelight from torches that had been thrown into the dry brush. Emma knelt behind it with a rifle she'd scavenged from somewhere, taking careful shots at 6 men who'd trapped them in a box canyon with no way out. Mary and Beth huddled behind a boulder with Lucy and Alice, the older girls trying to shield the younger ones from the hell that was erupting around them. And advancing on their position, using professional tactics that meant these weren't random hired guns, came the 6 men who'd been waiting in the canyon all along. This had been planned. The attack on the ranch, the chase, even the girls' escape route, all of it had been anticipated and prepared for. Thornton had been playing chess while everyone else was playing checkers, but Caleb Morrison had one advantage that Thornton hadn't counted on. He had absolutely nothing left to lose. His first shot took down the man closest to the girls, spinning him around and dropping him face first into the rocky ground. His second caught another gunman in the shoulder, spoiling his aim just as he lined up a shot at Emma. "Behind you!" Emma shouted, and Caleb dove sideways as bullets from Thornton's pursuit party began raining down from the ridge above. He was caught in a crossfire now, trapped between the men in the canyon and the larger force that had followed him from the ranch. Mathematics said he was dead. Logic said he should surrender. But logic hadn't saved his own children 3 years ago, and it wasn't going to save these children now. Rolling behind a fallen tree, Caleb began the most desperate fighting of his life. Every shot had to count because there wasn't time to waste ammunition. Every movement had to be perfect because there wasn't room for mistakes. He put down another canyon gunman with a shot that would have made his old army sergeant proud, but return fire immediately chewed up the log he was hiding behind, forcing him to scramble for new cover. That's when he saw something that made his heart stop. Little Alice had broken away from her sisters and was running toward him, her broken doll clutched in her arms, tears streaming down her face as bullets kicked up dust around her small feet. "Uncle Caleb!" she cried, using a name that hit him like a physical blow. "Uncle Caleb, help us!" Uncle. This child who'd known him for less than a day was calling him uncle. trusting him with the kind of faith that only children could give. Time slowed as Caleb saw a rifle barrel swinging toward Alice's running form. The man holding it had a clear shot, and at 6 years old, she made an easy target. Caleb didn't think. He didn't calculate angles or consider consequences. He simply threw himself out of cover, taking the bullet meant for Alice in his chest as he crashed into her small body and rolled them both behind a boulder. The impact drove the air from his lungs and filled his mouth with the taste of copper. Blood soaked through his shirt as he pressed Alice against the rock, her terrified sobs muffled against his shoulder. "It's okay, little one," he whispered, though he could feel his strength bleeding out into the desert sand. "Uncle Caleb's got you." But even as he said it, he could see the situation deteriorating. Emma was down to her last few bullets. The other girls were surrounded, and more of Thornton's men were pouring down into the canyon like water through a broken dam. That's when Caleb heard something that changed everything. Bugle calls, coming from the east, where the main road to the territorial capital cut through the desert. U.S. cavalry, a full patrol by the sound of it, riding hard toward the gunfire. Thornton had made his final mistake. In his eagerness to silence witnesses, he'd created a battle big enough to attract federal attention. But the cavalry was still minutes away, and Alice was bleeding from a graze on her arm, where Caleb hadn't been fast enough to shield her completely. Minutes they didn't have. If you've enjoyed this story so far, hit that subscribe button, because you won't believe how this ends. Caleb looked at the journal sticking out of Emma's torn dress, then at Alice's trusting face, then at the approaching sounds of salvation that might arrive too late. He had one bullet left, one final choice to make. And as Thornton himself appeared at the canyon's edge, gun drawn and murder in his eyes, Caleb Morrison prepared to make the most important shot of his life. Caleb Morrison raised his rifle with hands that shook from blood loss, lining up the most important shot of his life as Silas Thornton stood silhouetted against the canyon rim. One bullet, one chance to end the monster who'd built an empire on the suffering of children. But as his finger tightened on the trigger, Alice stirred in his arms. "Uncle Caleb," she whispered, her small voice cutting through the chaos like a prayer. "Are we going to be okay?" In that moment, Caleb realized something that changed everything. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It wasn't about justice or making Thornton pay for his crimes. This was about a 6-year-old girl who needed to believe that good could triumph over evil. Instead of shooting Thornton, Caleb turned his rifle toward the canyon wall and fired his last bullet into a pile of loose rocks above the remaining gunmen. The avalanche was small but effective, burying 2 of Thornton's men and creating enough chaos for Emma to grab the journal and run toward Caleb's position. "The cavalry's coming," she shouted as she slid behind the boulder. "I can see their dust." Thornton's voice echoed off the canyon walls, filled with rage and desperation. "Kill them all. Leave no witnesses." But his men were already starting to break. The sound of approaching bugles meant federal troops, and federal troops meant questions that Thornton's money couldn't buy off. One by one, the hired guns began slipping away into the desert shadows, abandoning their employer to save themselves. Only Thornton and 3 of his most loyal killers remained, trapped in a canyon that was about to become their grave. The cavalry arrived like avenging angels, blue uniforms and gleaming sabers pouring into the canyon as Captain Benjamin Hayes led his patrol down the narrow trail. "This is the U.S. Army," Hayes shouted. "Throw down your weapons." Thornton's response was to grab a rifle from one of his fallen men and take aim at Emma. But Caleb still had one weapon left, the Derringer he'd used to kill Webb. Both shots fired simultaneously. Thornton's bullet went wide as Caleb's Derringer ball took him center mass, spinning the corrupt businessman around and dropping him face first into the canyon floor. The last 3 gunmen surrendered immediately, throwing down their weapons as cavalry soldiers surrounded them. Captain Hayes dismounted and surveyed the carnage with the experienced eye of a man who'd seen too much violence on the frontier. "What happened here?" he demanded. Emma stood up slowly, the journal clutched against her chest, and began to speak. Her young voice was steady as she told the story. The murders at the orphanage, the evidence they'd witnessed, the night-long battle to survive. When she finished, Hayes looked at the journal she handed him, his face growing darker with each page he turned. "Sweet Mother of God," he breathed. "This goes all the way to the territorial governor's office. That's why they had to silence us," Emma said quietly. "We were the only witnesses." Hayes nodded grimly. "Not anymore. This journal, combined with your testimony, We'll bring down everyone involved in this corruption. As the cavalry medic worked on Caleb's wounds, wrapping bandages around his chest and shoulder, Alice climbed into his lap with her broken doll. "Uncle Caleb," she said seriously, "are you going to die?" Caleb looked down at this brave little girl who'd survived hell and still worried about others. At Emma, who'd protected her sisters with the fierce courage of a lioness. At Mary, Beth, and Lucy, who'd never again have to fear the monsters who'd stolen their childhood. "No, little one," he said softly. "I'm not going to die. Not today." And for the first time in 3 years, Caleb Morrison meant those words. 6 months later, Caleb stood in the doorway of his rebuilt ranch house, watching 5 girls play in the yard he'd turned into a proper home. The children's home had been shut down, its corrupt officials imprisoned or fled. Thornton's criminal network had been dismantled piece by piece, the journal providing evidence that reached into 3 territories. Emma, now 15, had become the unofficial leader of their unusual family, helping Caleb transform the ranch into a place where damaged children could heal. Mary and Beth had started attending the new school in town, their laughter returning gradually as nightmares faded. Lucy had learned to smile again. And Alice still called him Uncle Caleb, and still carried her broken doll everywhere. But now the doll had been carefully mended, its head reattached with loving stitches that would never let it fall apart again. Just like the family they'd all become. The man who'd been digging his own grave had found something better than the death he'd planned. He'd found redemption in protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. And as the sun set over the Texas desert, painting the sky the color of hope, Caleb Morrison finally understood what it meant to be truly alive. Some men are born to greatness. Others have greatness thrust upon them. But a rare few find greatness in the simple act of standing between evil and innocence, no matter the cost. Caleb Morrison had found his purpose in 5 orphaned girls who appeared when he needed them most. And they had found their salvation in a man who'd given up on everything except doing what was right. Now click on the video on the screen to hear a story even better than this one, with a twist so powerful you won't forget it anytime soon. Click on the video now.